All right, so just a little bit more. This in regards to my grandpa, how I feel like he kind of moved me toward the right wing, and then, like I said, he confused me again, and I became a left winger again. So I became a right winger, nationalist, pro-white, to a left winger, communist, anti-white, and I'll kind of describe a little bit more how my grandpa kind of moved me in that direction toward the right wing. And so, like, one example too was like my grandpa said, like I said, Jesus said, blessed are the poor. And when I was a communist, I'd be like, yeah, the poor, it's the poor who are good, and the rich are evil. And I was anti-white, and I wanted redistribution of wealth and to like destroy white people and take down the borders. And I was like, isn't that non-dual consciousness to take down the borders and share your wealth? And so I misappropriated my grandpa's teachings. He didn't really teach me well, though. He didn't really teach me what the flow was. So I was just confused. I thought that when he was talking about the flow and non-dual consciousness, he was talking about like everybody mix and be, But so I was just confused. But so he was, my grandpa was like, no, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit and stuff. And he's like, for they will be, they will be, I forget what Jesus said, like they will be satisfied or something, right? But then when I became more of a right winger, like I said, I became more of a right winger in like 2016 to 2020. I was like, well, yeah, grandpa. So he's saying like, if you're in the flow, then you won't be poor. So it's not really prosperity gospel, but I'm like, yeah, if you're in the flow, then you have less likelihood to be poor. Now, my grandpa wouldn't necessarily say that. He would say, like, you want to just be in inquiry and be in the flow. And if you're in the flow, you're not attached to anything, but you could be rich. But if you're rich, but you're not attached to anything. Because if you're in the flow, now I know it, but at the time I didn't really understand. But if you're in the flow, you can't be attached to anything because you have to be spontaneous and you have to not have any attachments because you have to be, open to inspiration, right? And spontaneity. And if you're attached to anything, you can't be. But my grandpa would be like, well, you could be rich, but you might not be attached to stuff. And that's kind of like what Yogananda taught too. Right? It's kind of more of a right winger type of orientation. Like, no, being rich is fine. Ayn Rand, and my grandpa was into Ayn Rand. So I was like, so I started to become more of a right winger and be like, yeah, so okay, grandpa. So, but if you are in the flow and you are in inquiry and you are in, oneness consciousness, then you're more likely to be rich. And that's what Jesus was saying. Like, blessed are the hungry, because they shall find food. And he's not saying like, he's not a communist. He's not like extolling poor people or hungry people. He's saying like, if you're in the flow, if you're in the flow, then you won't be hungry and you'll have more money. Not necessarily, but more likely, or at least if you're in the flow, you will not be suffering so much, right? So that's the way I was moving more toward the right wing orientation. And then just like another thing was like my grandpa made a big deal about like not being an activist, because like my activism is like dualistic software, like right versus wrong, agreeing or disagreeing. And my grandpa would say, don't agree or disagree, because if you agree or disagree, you're not open to inquiry. You're not open to truth. You're just agreeing because it's satisfying your ego or whatever. But rather than agreeing or disagreeing, you just want to remain receptive to truth and inquiry, right? And transcend the ego. And in like, in activism be like, right versus wrong software. Like, no, Black lives matter, or like, black people are oppressed. And that like my grandpa would say that Facebook has a lot of right versus wrong software where people post a meme and basically it's inviting people to agree or disagree or say, no, that's right or that's wrong. And that my grandpa would say that that's soap opera and that's dualistic software because it's confirming the self by arguing as opposed to like trying to seek the truth. One thing that my grandpa taught was like, Jesus says, do not judge. And my grandpa would be like, yeah, do not judge. Judging is emotional and it's self-confirmatory, and the self is an illusion, right? But my grandpa would be like, but discernment is different than judging. So discernment would be recognition of the truth, and it's not judging because it's not based around the ego. And it's not emotional, and it's not, judgmental. It's not self-confirmatory. But, my grandpa said that basically, so he was moving more to a right wing because he's like, yeah, activism. Like, I asked him what later I would ask him what he thought about like, reggae music. And again, like I associate reggae music with black people, right? And my grandpa's like, well, I don't really like reggae music. It's more like activism music, right? And right versus wrong and self-confirmatory. Now, I would say, in the right wing perspective, reggae wouldn't be good because it's like, first off, it's black music, and yeah, it's like, for drugs, which destroys morality, which could destroy the white race and stuff like that, right? But I was becoming more a right winger and wanting to just preserve the white race. And I started thinking like, yeah, well, white people have more swag flow and stuff like that. So I was moving more toward the right wing. Now, just a few more examples in that vein would be like, just like some of the things that my grandpa was doing that was moving toward the right wing was like, you know, the Nazis. Like I feel like my grandpa was making me more into a Nazi because like he would kind of be like saying things that to me were kind of like Nazi like, right? Like right wing white supremacist Nazi like. So for instance, my grandpa was like, this is like 2019. This is about the time of 2019. I asked my grandpa like, well, what do you think of the Freemasons? And my grandpa was like, well, you know, because he's not a Freemason. And he was like, well, you know, the Freemasons, he said that it's a club, and in clubs, there's insider, outsider, there tends to be expression of insider, outsider dualistic software. And I would later misappropriate this when I became a left winger. So I would take my grandpa's teachings and misappropriate them through my ego because I hadn't really understood what he meant by the flow. And I'll get to that later. And transcending the ego. Because he didn't teach me well. But, you know, he was like, yeah, in clubs, there's like the Freemasons, there's insider, outsider software. And that's self-confirmatory because, you know, you have your insider stuff and you hold outsiders away. And that's confirming the illusion of the separate self. And remember, when I was like a anti-Christian, anti-white, I would utilize my grandpa's teachings like that and be like, yeah, you know, Christianity's insider, outsider software, and, you know, you want to not be transcend the self so you could be open to inspiration and the flow and stuff. But again, my grandpa would say that, you know, sometimes groups and stuff can be a concession, like the Jews having their rituals, that can be a concession to work in progress, my grandpa would say, to the flow. Because, you know, and my grandpa, he didn't believe in God, but he thought that everything is energy. So, like, by following the rituals, it takes you out of your whims and your habits, and that can help you get into the flow and, you know, all that, right? So, but he didn't believe in a separate God because that would be dualistic, and everything is one. There is no separate God. But my grandpa thought that everything is energy. But, you know, Dr. Horror, I'll get to this later, he believed that God is intelligence. He called it infinite intelligence love, cosmic intelligence love. And he would say that, you know, and he kind of believed in like the world of forms. But my grandpa, he didn't believe in that. He tried to make everything very naturalistic and scientific. And that was what also moved me more toward the left wing when he was like that. Because I always saw like my grandpa's kind of anti-religious, and anti-religion is more left wing. But my grandpa wasn't necessarily like that. But my grandpa, he didn't believe what Dr. Hora taught. And I'll get to this later. But Dr. Hora kind of believed in taught the world of forms. Like this world's a hologram. But my grandpa would be like, I don't understand the world of forms. My grandpa would be like, I think that everything's energy, but that's not what Dr. Hora taught. I always get more into that. Like, one thing was, like, I would read to my grandpa, like, something about Christian Science. And my grandpa would be like, yeah, that makes sense. Everything is energy. And I'd be like, that's not what Christian Science is saying. Christian Science is saying everything is mind. So my grandpa would be like, yeah, well, they're right. You know, you can heal things because everything is energy. Everything is one. Everything's energy. But I'd be like, but that's not what Christian Science is saying. It's saying that everything is mind. My grandpa would be like, well, they're synonymous. Like energy is non-tangible like mind. I don't understand what it means by mind. My grandpa thought that mind was an epiphenomena. Consciousness was an epiphenomena of energy patterns, right? He thought that was an illusion, but energy was real. But that's the opposite of what Dr. Hora taught. And that's what I would find later when I read Dr. Hora's books. So my grandpa had me all confused. And I would always tell my grandpa, like, I don't agree with you, this whole thing. Don't disagree or agree. Just be open. But I'd be like, no, I don't agree with you. This whole everything is energy thing, that doesn't seem right to me. Because he didn't believe the quadrant model either. And a part of it was he thought it was like magical thinking. And he didn't understand the world of forms. And, you know, reality is like a projection of the quadrant pattern. And my grandpa didn't understand that. He thought that was magical thinking. He was very rationalistic and naturalistic. And I don't know if a part of it was because maybe he thought that I was going crazy with the quadrant model and he was trying to like ground me or something. Or maybe that's just the way he was. But he didn't understand reality. You know, he didn't understand the world of forms. He didn't understand that this world is a projection of the quadrant pattern. And he confused me. And I just don't think that he understood reality. But he had good insights in other forms, in other ways. So, but my point is, my grandpa was moving me more toward the right wing in the way that he would teach certain things. So, like one example too was like the story of Lilith, where Lilith is a woman who apparently had sex with Adam sitting on top of Adam. And I asked my grandpa, what do you think is the meaning of that? Like, why was Lilith a demon who was on top of Adam during sex? Why does that make her a demon? And my grandpa was like, well, it could be because it's an expression of superior, inferior software, like top dog, underdog, dualistic software, right? That confirms illusion of the separate self. And he said, my grandpa said, instead of trying to be superior or inferior, he said also being equal is not also dualistic software. Because when you're equal, you still believe that there's a self and other people, but you're trying to be equal. And my grandpa's like, instead of being equal or superior or inferior, you want to be in the flow and just go all out and just be an inquiry. And that's why my grandpa was kind of against activism, right? Because it's like dualistic, right? And confirming the separate self. But he said just be an inquiry. And my grandpa was like, yeah, Sojourner Truth, she didn't fight slavery. She just was an inquiry. Sojourner Truth means to seek the truth, and slavery could not hold her. But again, I always thought this was right wing, like blaming, oh, so the slaves were slaves because they weren't in the flow. They weren't just seeking the truth. They weren't in the flow, so that's why they were enslaved. So I was always like, oh, this is right wing. It's anti, it's pro-white, anti-people of color, and all that, like, victim blaming type of thing. But that's kind of what my grandpa kind of was teaching, like, no, don't be like Lilith, who tried to be superior to Adam, or inferior or equal, but just be in the flow, just go all out and just so. But this whole like no activism thing, like it was like anti-Black Lives Matter in my opinion. That's what I thought. So I was like, yeah, when I was a leftist, I was for Black Lives Matter, and I was kind of more for activism, right? But I thought my grandpa's like, yeah, just be in the flow, and no, activism's not good. And I was like, yeah, well, when I was a communist Marxist, I wanted activism, I wanted anchor, and I felt like religion and spirituality, which I thought my grandpa was upholding, was always just white supremacy. Like, yeah, don't be an activist, just be content and just be in the flow and pure awareness and meditation. And I thought it was just a tool to maintain the status quo and maintain white supremacy and stuff. But now I understand what my grandpa's saying, like, yeah, but my grandpa would say, like, in the flow, there's no formula. So sometimes activism in the flow could be a part of it. Like, you never really know. And sometimes someone who's not being an activist, he could not be in the flow. And I'll just give, like, one example of that was, like, when I became a right-winger, this was in, like, the 2014 time, like I said, I was like, oh, so, like, the black people express more dualistic software, huh, Grandpa, more sentimentalism and emotionalism, because they tend to be more, like, chaotic and show attitude and stuff, so they're inferior, right? And I wanted to believe that, but my grandpa was like, well, but and I was like, well, and Asians must be superior because they don't express the dualistic software as much. But my grandpa was like, well, just because Asians might be more inhibited doesn't mean that they're not expressing dualistic software. Just because you're inhibited doesn't mean you're not in the flow. Doesn't mean you're in the flow just because you're inhibited. So that's what kind of moved me more toward the left wing again. So I was like, oh, so black people aren't bad, because, being inhibited, that could still be self-confirmatory. And being all crazy like a black person, like, wild and, attitude and, loud and, how the stereotypes of black people, like, that could, my grandpa would be like, well, you can get in the flow by doing that. You can lose yourself by doing that. There's no formula for the flow. So that's a moving more toward left wing. But then again, like I said, I was moving more toward right wing again. Because my grandpa would be like, and my grandpa would talk about, like, so I would be confused, but my grandpa would talk about, like, yeah, promiscuity is self-confirmatory and it's not existentially valid. It doesn't lead to happiness, right? My grandpa would teach me more what existentially valid meant when I read Dr. Horror's book in 2020. But, like, he would say, like, promiscuity is not good. And when I was a left-winger communist, I was always for promiscuity, because I was like, oh, the people who are against promiscuity, those are just the right-winger white supremacists who want to just maintain the white race and make women into baby makers. But now I understand what my grandpa was saying. Like, he's talking about transcending the self, but there's no formula once again, right? But, if you're doing sensualism and sensualism, that's confirming the body, like, through your sensations, right? And the idea, now I know the idea is everything is an illusion, like everything is one, there is no thing, right? Now, Nietzsche would say, yeah, well, people who are like that, they just say that because that's a way to get power. That's the way the priests get power, right? By being like, oh, this world's just an illusion, so it's okay that I don't have a harem of women just because, I'm just because it's all an illusion anyways. And, he didn't like Platonism, but my grandpa was kind of like, my grandpa said he didn't understand what Platonism was. My grandpa was like, everything is energy. But regardless, my point is my grandpa was moving more toward the right wing though, because, he was like the whole anti, like, welfare type of stuff, and just things that he would say, it would make it, to me, it was making me more right wing. And I was like, like I said, and my grandpa being against Freemasons, like I thought he was making me more Nazi-like, because my grandpa would be like, yeah, I wouldn't be a Freemason because, it tends to be like dualistic software and stuff, insider, outsider. And like Hitler, he didn't like Freemasons. Now I know Hitler didn't like Freemasons because, he thought that they were liberal and they were for race mixing and stuff like that, right? And they were very tied to Jews, and he thought the Jews were for race mixing and destroying the Aryans, right? But, my grandpa, so my grandpa wouldn't say it that way, but my grandpa would be like, well, it's dual, it could be an expression of dualistic software because insider, outsider, dualistic software, and so on and so forth. So, like, everything that the Nazis were for, I felt like my grandpa was for, but he would just shade it in more, like, spiritual language. And I always thought that spirituality and religion was just white supremacy in and of itself. But like I said, at this time, I was becoming a right-winger white supremacist. I was one in, like, 2014 to 2020. Or no, like, 2016 to 2020. So I was a right-winger. So I was like, just another example was my grandpa was like, he said that, like, he told me that the problem with Jews and the problem with Jews and homosexuals, because the problem with Jews and homosexuals is that they identify as Jews and identify as homosexuals. So my grandpa was like, yeah, the thing about homosexuals that's the problem is they identify as homosexuals and they think like, oh, I figured it all out, I'm a homosexual, and they create their identity around their homosexuality and stuff, right? And my grandpa's like, well, when you're in the flow, as Jesus said, there is no Jew or Greek. There is no homosexual or heterosexual. There is no black or white. That's what my grandpa would talk about, right? So, because my grandpa would be like, because in the flow, you lose yourself. You're in the flow. You transcend the ego. You transcend the identity. You transcend the self. And my grandpa would be like, you're not your proclivities. Yes, someone might have proclivities to be, to like, he might like other men, but that's not what you are. You are not your sensations. That's all an illusion. Right? Your body's an illusion. The sensations are an illusion. And you want to transcend that to the flow, right? So, and he said the same thing with Jews. My grandpa was like, Jews, they tend to like always talk about that they're Jews, and they tend to like be really attached to the identity of Jewish. And my grandpa was like, but that's not the flow. Now, I was like, well, Grandpa, you're pretty much a Nazi. You don't, you're anti-Jew, anti-homosexual. Like, I was like, you're just pretty much a Nazi. But that's not really necessarily what my grandpa was, but that's the way I saw it. But he was moving me more toward that way. So I was like, okay, so Jews should transcend and I was kind of antagonistic toward Jews because I thought that the Jews were for race mixing. And I was kind of antagonistic toward the homosexuals because I was like, yeah, homosexuality is not good for the white race. Because I was becoming more of a right-winger, white supremacist, nationalist. And I thought that my grandpa was basically the same thing, but my grandpa just clouded it in very, like, spiritual language. Like, no, because it's self-confirmatory and because, everything is one and the Jews identify as separate and the homosexuals identify as separate, So, I was basically, my grandpa's a Nazi, but I was moving more toward the Nazi way. Right, and I was essentially a Nazi from like 2016 to 2020. Like I was just a big time right winger, white, nationalist. Right, that's what Nazi is, a nationalist. That's what Nazi means, National Socialist. And like I'll just give an example. Like my friend Rod, or I'm not gonna say his name, but one of my friends is he would be like. He would be like, oh, Bernie Sanders, I don't like Bernie Sanders. He's a socialist like Hitler. Hitler was a socialist, But, my friend he's pretty much a white supremacist Nazi, though. But it's funny because, like, Bernie Sanders is for race mixing, and he's basically a communist and for, and you could tell, like, he kind of sees himself as more black. Like, he wears his hair, like, more black, and he's really into black people. Like, he gave that handshake to the black guy like this and everything. And, he's for, like, redistribution of wealth, taking it from white people, right? Or you could say, right? But he's for open borders and, what Hitler was against, right? And it's kind of ironic how sometimes, like, people will accuse others, or, like, I see it a lot with the like, white supremacists. Like, some of my friends would be like, oh, yeah, Bernie Sanders, he's a Nazi, or, they would say, like, Democrats or left-wingers are Nazis. And they would accuse them of what, when they're really Nazis, you know what I mean? But the thing is, it's like we associate the word Nazi with something very negative, but it's just they're nationalists, and they're not for like the race mixing. They're not for like the borders and opening borders and giving the wealth, taking the wealth from the rich and giving it to the poor, taking from white people and giving it to the brown people, and so on and so forth. But regardless, my grandpa was moving more to a right wing, and this was like 2020. And I became a right winger, and I was a big time nationalist. And I liked Trump at that time, and I was like, yeah, that's the way I was at that time. But then I'm gonna get to around 2020 is when I switched to becoming a left-wing communist again. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about how I moved to being went from being a right-wing nationalist back to being a left-wing communist, being a right-wing pro-white guy to a left-wing anti-white person. And that happened around 2020. So I'll get to that.